Welcome everyone back to weekly weather updates, and in today's video we do our second 2024-25 winter look ahead. Now, a couple of weeks ago we did our first update looking at all of the various September data from both the ECMWF longer range charts and looking at the stratosphere as well. Now, in today's video, we're going to have a look at a lot of those same charts with a few add-ons, but we are going to compare it to October's data as that has now come out in the last week or so. We're going to update the trends that we've been looking at, and we are going to see if there's anything new has been suggested in the latest rounds of updates. So do remember, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you like and subscribe. And remember to follow me on Twitter as well, the link's in the description. Now, of course, we've got to start by looking at what did we see in the last update and sort of comparing it to what we're going to see in this update. Now, of course, if you go back a couple of weeks to our first update, we did see quite a strong signal for a fairly strong stratospheric polar vortex early in the season at least, and we did see a fairly strong connection to the troposphere with a fairly strong tropospheric polar vortex towards Greenland and Canada. We saw a lot of negative anomalies in terms of the pressure, and we did see colder than average temperatures across much of Greenland and northern Canada, and that all does link together to give the impression of a fairly strong jet stream and fairly strong, as I said, tropospheric polar vortex. Now, I've already skimmed through the runs we're looking at today, and we do see a similar trend, but with some slight alterations. And the first chart we're looking at is the mean sea level pressure, sort of the ground pin to all the models that we're going to be looking at, because everything pivots off what is happening at the mean sea level pressure. If we've got a high pressure over the top of us, it's most likely going to be drier. We've got low pressure, it's going to be wetter. High pressure to our east, easterly winds. High pressure to the north and west, potentially northerly winds. So everything is kind of pinned off the mean sea level pressure. So I think it is one of the most important charts to look at in that longer range. And you can see we've got the October data, and this is a 3-monthly period looking at November, December and January. So it does mean that there could be lots of hidden oscillations within these charts. These are the overall sort of anomaly for those 3 months. So there's a chance November could be extremely westerly, January could be extremely westerly, December could be exceptionally blocked and cold. These charts would actually probably show mostly westerly flow because it is a average across the 3 months. So we do have to take that into account. And you can see here for November, December and January, we've got very strong low pressure towards northern Canada and stretching towards Greenland, which does follow on pretty well from our last update for a very strong tropospheric polar vortex positioned towards North America. You can see though for the UK to our south, we got fairly strong higher pressure, which again is fairly similar to our last update. That would probably indicate a fairly strong jet stream. Again, we can't say how amplified that jet stream will be, as that will subtly change depending on smaller shifts in the high pressure, low pressure flow. But what we are seeing a little bit is some yellows to our north, towards Iceland and towards Scandinavia. And you can see it is just a little bit of an extension of high pressure up from Europe, and we didn't see this in last update. You can see it is extending slightly further northwards, not really penetrating into the Arctic, so we can't really say proper northern blocking. So perhaps hints of some sort of Scandinavian or Icelandic high developing, battling against a fairly strong westerly flow. So that's a slight alteration from our last run, and it does give perhaps a bit of an indication that there is a bit of cold potential in an overall mild westerly wet sort of outlook. Now, as I said, because this is a 3-monthly period, there's a chance that what we're seeing here is 2 different outcomes have compounded together. We could be looking at a very wet and windy November and December, and then a cold, blocked Easterlies in January. That's what the model could be seeing here, and being a 3-monthly period, it could have compiled it on top of each other. So again, it'll be interesting to have a look at the next couple of frames to see how this progresses through the rest of the winter. But you can see we are seeing a continuation of that overall trend of a very strong tropospheric polar vortex, perhaps though a little bit of signs of some high pressure shifting northwards towards Northern Europe, Iceland, as I said, maybe even extending slightly into Greenland. Could be more transient, or it could be something that is just starting to appear in the outlook. Now, if you have a look at the next period, this is December, January and February, very similar over northern Canada and towards Greenland. Still got these very strong blues, but you can see towards the mid-Atlantic, again, still strong yellows, so again indicating a fairly strong westerly flow. High pressure, though, extending more over the UK, maybe up towards Scandinavia as well. Again, that could indicate that we have got high pressure trying to force its way northwards, but coming up against the tropospheric polar vortex. So a bit of a battle going on there. So again, very interesting seeing that. It is the sort of pattern that could show a lot of promise for high pressure blocking and in the end deliver very little. Or it could be the sort of pattern that doesn't promise much, but in the end could deliver quite a lot of cold weather. Because if this does shift northwards, we see a bit of undercutting. We could actually see fairly cold conditions from no real exceptional anomaly charts cropping up here. So again, very interesting. There is this sort of white envelope heading up towards Greenland, Iceland and Scandinavia, whereas if you look along that latitude, there is quite a lot of blue across the northern hemisphere. So again, indications there could be high pressure blocking setting up, but there's no overwhelming signal, which is what we ideally want to see if, you're going to forecast a proper colder month or colder period, for example. Definitely looks mild, but with potential for colder incursions. If we look at the next period, January, February and March, you can see a very similar pattern. More blues taking over in Greenland, which can happen as we head into the early part of the following year. And that is because that is when the polar vortex, the stratospheric polar vortex, if I'm being specific, is at its strongest. It's kind of December, January, and that could lead to a very strong tropospheric polar vortex. That's why we can see very stormy conditions through January and February. But it's the same sort of pattern. Very strong westerly flow coming off the Atlantic, and then coming up against some higher pressure across Europe, Scandinavia, and the UK. Now, it could mean that we just stay settled, slightly chilly, a bit of an inversion. But if that high pressure, as I said a couple of minutes ago, heads slightly further northwards, we see some lower pressure undercutting it. We could see potentially transient snow events, maybe even low pressure systems sliding into a cold block of air. Because we have to remember, at this point, we've got very cold air to our north and our east. It's just about tapping into it. And that is the problem we see every single year. Can we see any northerly or easterly flows bringing in cold weather up against a westerly onslaught? And that's the kind of pattern we're seeing quite strong here. So again, very, very similar. All three of these frames, they've altered slightly in the anomaly, colour and the exact positioning of those anomalies, but they are fairly similar. The last frame we'll look at is the one for February going into March and April. And again, it's pretty much very similar. Yes, the anomalies aren't quite as strong, and that's expected being at this time frame. Again, lots of blues towards our north, negative anomaly, lower pressure, yellow towards our south, with a bit ridging again towards that gap between Iceland and Greenland, Iceland and Scandinavia, Again, giving hints that we could see easterly or northerly flows at times. Now, again, I will emphasise these are 3 monthly periods, like all the charts we're going to see from the ECMWF. So they are broad signals. They're not forecasting any specifics, but they are kind of stating what the overall setup can be. And for what we've seen here, kind of to summarise it, I'd say it's a fairly strong westerly flow, fairly strong jet stream throughout much of the winter, but at times could come up against a bit of a battle with higher pressure trying to ridge northwards. The success of that battle, who wins out, high pressure or low pressure, we cannot say until we actually get to the time. Because any subtle differences, a few hundred miles between the high pressure, low pressure positioning can be the difference between a big cold block of air coming in off Europe or a westerly flow with that cold air remaining back in Central and Northern Europe. So little subtle things like that we cannot decipher at this time frame, but what we can decipher is what that trend is. And yeah, very interesting and a little bit of a shift from our latest update. To back that up, if we have a look at the precipitation, what we'd expect to see here is a lot of precipitation across parts of northern Canada, parts of Greenland, less precipitation across Europe, as that should follow that low pressure, high pressure pattern. And you can see here for the November, December, January period, that's exactly what we see. High precipitation across northern Canada, again, indicative of the tropospheric polar vortex. Lots of lower pressure, higher pressure more towards Europe. You can't see it's not overwhelmingly brown, so not overwhelmingly dry, but it is drier and there's no massive greens across much of Europe at all. For the next period, as we head into December, January, February, greens out in the North Atlantic trying to head towards us. But again, we are fairly dry, around average or even below average. With some browns there across Northern Europe and some oranges. Again, it's difficult to see exactly, but you can see we aren't under greens at all. We are not above average in terms of precipitation. Again, indicative of some higher pressure. And higher pressure in the winter always delivers colder conditions. Not going to say snowy, not going to say wintry, but colder conditions simply because we'll see an inversion, we'll see easterly flows, and again, those are always relatively chilly during winter months. But again, I must emphasize the North Atlantic, lots of greens, so definitely lots of storm systems, lots of low pressure systems that would try and push in. If we now look at January, February and March, very similar, almost exactly the same. Browns near us, over the top of us and slightly to our north, lots of greens to our west. Again, emphasising that west to east battle. If we do finally have a look at February, March and April, you can see the greens do start to push more in towards us. You see a bit more greens there across parts of Ireland and heading into the North Sea. So perhaps low pressure breaking through a little bit. But again, it could be coming up against colder air. Some of that precipitation could be snow. We can't tell at this time frame. So again, it's not an overwhelmingly blocked pattern. We did have quite a lot of blocking in last year's updates, especially towards Greenland. Some of that came to fruition. We did see quite a bit of blocked conditions, but in the end, on sort of the micro scale, on the day-to-day scale, we didn't get anything major in terms of delivery. We saw lots of blocking, lots of interesting synoptics, but actually at the surface, we never got anything kind of lived up to that blocking. Could we be seeing the opposite here? No exceptional anomaly charts, perhaps a bit of blocking, but could we see something interesting at the surface as we get nearer the time? We'll have to wait and see. Now, the final run I just wanted to have a look at is the 2 metre temperature anomaly. Now, again, these are based off climate periods. You can see here from 1993 to 2016, and because of the warming climate, as we hear every year, the planet's warmed by this much degrees, or it's been the hottest year for the planet that we've got on record. We're expecting to see reds. We are expecting to see overwhelming reds across much of the planet. What we're really looking at for any cold weather is any not as strong positive anomaly, so not as red, yellows or whites, and maybe even some blues. That's indicative of average to below average. So that's what we're looking at for cold weather here. We're not going to see any darker blues on here towards Europe at all. It's almost impossible unless we were going to see a beast from the east or something like that. Just because of the climate period we're comparing to, it is very difficult at this time frame for the models to push out any sort of very cold scenarios. You can see though for November, December, January, very red across much of North Atlantic. So again, not indicative of anything majorly cold. The only really close to cold conditions we have is across Central Europe. It's not quite as positive. Again, that could be indicative of that cold air getting pushed in from the east with the high pressure over the top of us. And you can see across North America, much of Western Canada heading towards Alaska is generally white as well. Again, indicative of colder temperatures. As we head into the next period, December, January, February, fairly similar across Central Europe, generally around neutral, slightly positive. One interesting sign, though, is that in the North Atlantic, there is some neutral there and a little bit of blues towards the centre of it. Again, what I'm kind of seeing from that is cold air getting pushed out of Greenland into the North Atlantic as a result of the jet stream and storm systems really powering up. That's typically what we see. Warm air getting pushed up from the south, cold air getting pushed from the north, and that whips up some quite severe lows. So that's exactly what I'm seeing there. That's the jet stream at play, and that's the cold air pushing out into the North Atlantic, powering up those low pressure systems. But for the UK, you can see it is milder further westwards, slightly chillier further south than eastwards, and again, that's what I'd expect with the higher pressure positioning towards our south and our east. More inversions, maybe more colder air masses pushing in. And then if we look at January, February and March, very similar, even a stronger colder anomaly there towards the North Atlantic. Again, that's very interesting to see. And then the final period, February, March and April, pretty much exactly the same, with much of North America, especially Canada and Alaska, being very cold, or at least a pretty neutral anomaly there. So again, can't really pick too much from these 2-meter temperature anomaly charts, just because you can see they're overwhelmingly red. So you're kind of looking for small little deviations. It's very difficult to say exactly what we'll see. But regardless, still a chart to look at, and you can see again it does follow on from the precipitation and the pressure charts, fairly similar. So we are seeing fairly strong correlations, which is good, which means that the models, or at least what we're reading from the models, is fairly accurate. Now, I do want to move on to something that could be driving that very strong tropospheric polar vortex, and that is the stratospheric polar vortex. And of course, in the last update, we did see that it was very weak as of the time of recording that update, which was late September, and then it went very strong into October. We are still very weak, as you can see here on the left of the screen. We are close to the minimum that we really see this time, at 10 meters per second. But you can see in the next couple of weeks, towards the final week or so of October, we strengthen towards average, and then we go quite far above average as we head into early November, and through much of November, really. Doesn't look like it's anywhere near as positive in terms of anomaly as we're seeing in our last update. So it's not quite as off the scale as we were seeing. It was a massive rise in last update, but it is still positive. So just a slight downwards correction, but no real major changes. Does look like a fairly strong stratospheric polar vortex heading into early winter, or at least late autumn. And again, that would be suggestive of more of westerly flow being inclined there. But you can see there are some weaker runs. Maybe a handful of 5 to 10 within this larger ensemble suite from the Eastern WF that go down to sudden stratospheric warming levels. Again, we always see these, and until we start to see maybe a third or at least a quarter of the runs showing that, then we're not really going to talk about it at all, because we always see these colder, colder runs, i.e. sudden stratospheric warming would probably force some sort of colder conditions. So these sort of runs, we always see them, but until we see a larger proportion of the ensemble showing it, we're not really going to bat an eyelid at it. You can see, though, majority are average to above average, indicative of a fairly strong polar vortex. If we do look at more of the shorter range, you can see this again evolving here on the charts from the weatheriscool.com. You can see on the left, this is the actual wind speeds with the pressure levels, and you can see going from 1 HPA down to 10 HPA, that's sort of the stratospheric level, 30 HPA down towards 1000 HPA, and that is getting towards the surface, towards the troposphere. And that's, yes, much of the troposphere there. And on the right, we've got the anomaly, so blues below average, reds and oranges above average. And you can see very clearly on the left, we are seeing a stronger polar vortex, and you can see more oranges descending throughout the pressure levels. And you can see on the right, we go from blues throughout much of the atmosphere to reds and oranges, indicative of a fairly weak polar vortex at the moment, only by maybe 5 to 10 meters per second, to a very strong polar vortex by, again, around 5 to 10 meters per second. So you can see here, the last chart we looked at was the Eastern WF. This is the GFS, and you can see fairly strong signal there for that to happen in the next couple of weeks. And you can see another chart here, which is a line graph showing something very similar. You can see the blue on the left. That is what we've seen so far through the year. And you can see it is slowly being well below average. And you can see it is progressing towards average. And those greens are the GFS ensembles. And you see the majority of them get towards average or above average as we progress towards late October. And as we saw from the longer range ECMWF charts, it does look like it could strengthen much, much further. You can see the dotted red line is last winter's, and you see we saw a fairly strong polar vortex towards early winter, and then it dropped off massively into the second half of winter with a sudden stratospheric warming into January. And of course, we did see some consequences of that, but not the exceptional conditions that we can see, i.e. beasts from the east or similar. We didn't see anything like that, and I know a lot of people were a bit annoyed, a bit frustrated, but it happens. Again, not every sudden stratospheric warming produces something exceptional. Some produce beasts from the east, some produce nothing, and we were kind of in the middle towards that nothing end. We did see blocking, we did see some colder conditions, but nothing too exceptional that people would have looked for. So you can see the longer range pressure charts, definitely suggestive of a fairly strong westerly flow, at least definitely early on in the winter. Maybe a bit of blocking, high pressure building in towards the middle portion of the winter. Again, very difficult to talk about timings, but that signal is definitely there. And you see the reason probably why that tropospheric polar vortex is so strong and the jet stream is so strong is what we're seeing here on the stratosphere. Now, I do want to put some sort of images to these charts we've been looking at. And that's why we can have a look at the CFS. Now, the CFS isn't the best model, I must admit. It is a longer range model. I would not use it for short range forecasting because it isn't particularly high resolution, but it has a good go at looking at some of the longer ranges. This is the daily run that goes out towards the next sort of 4, 5, 6 months. So we can pretty much cover most of the winter here. Now, again, we're not looking at individual days. This is showing individual 24 hours. We are not looking at individual days because there is no chance anyone or any model can forecast individual days beyond about 7 to 14 days. There is zero chance. But what we're looking for is trends because this model output comes from model input. There is stuff that goes into this, the same data that goes into all the other models we're looking at, and the CFS just looks at it in a different way, of course, it's a different model, and then forecasts on a day-to-day basis. So I just want to see, are we seeing the same trends that we've just seen in the ECMWF in the CFS as well? Now, we're starting here on the 1st of December, and already we can see some strong resemblance with those ECMWF longer range charts. Strong tropospheric polar vortex towards northern Canada and Greenland, low pressure pooling out into the North Atlantic, and high pressure extending in towards the UK. Now, it's not a terribly cold area of high pressure. It would be slight easterly flow, so it probably would be a little bit chilly. But very interesting indeed that it is pretty much exactly what we were seeing from those ECMWF anomaly charts. So perhaps CFS is picking up on a very similar pattern. You can see this continues for much of early December. We do even see some southerly flows. That could actually be warm if that air did originate directly from the south. If it's more of a southeasterly tilt, then it could be colder. Again, impossible to say at this time frame. You can see, though, there's some northerly winds around the Christmas period, perhaps chillier conditions at times, Atlantic ridging, but no major blocking. So again, could be some colder conditions, could be chilly, but we're not seeing any major blocking. And you can see the high pressure keeps trying to penetrate into the Arctic, and you can see it is successful at times, but never really pulls off anything major throughout December. So again, that's actually pretty similar to what we've seen from those anomaly charts from the ECMWF. High pressure trying to extend northwards, but not being terribly successful. As we head into early January, we do actually see the Atlantic unlock, and it does go pretty unsettled and pretty westerly. But as we head towards the middle of the month, high pressure builds in once again and kind of sits over the top of us. Would probably be chilly, but we wouldn't see much in the way of winteriness. As we head towards the end of January, you see a strong northerly wind as that high pressure retrogresses out into the North Atlantic. But again, it's not a proper block, so it does subside very quickly. In the following days and weeks, again, high pressure keeps trying to nudge in, but we see a strong westerly flow, and it keeps trying to extend northwards, and it has success at times, building in towards Scandinavia, Northern Europe, and trying to produce chilly conditions through much of February. But still, westerly onslaught continues to try and build in, and for the 1st of March, a very similar pattern. So we've basically just very quickly run through the whole of winter there from this latest CFS chart, and actually, it does follow on broadly very similar from what we saw from those ECMWF anomalies, which is positive, as it does mean that we can put a little bit more into those charts, as we can see that both of these models are seeing something within the model output. They're seeing something to show that higher pressure is trying to build in for long periods of time, but the tropospheric polar vortex is going to be very strong and going to try and hold it off. Again, I can't say for certain, but most likely that tropospheric polar vortex forecast is more because of that stratospheric polar vortex forecast. So that's why it's very important looking at those stratospheric charts, because if that does weaken, we'd probably expect a bit of a follow-through into the tropospheric charts, where our weather actually takes place. And again, if we start to see signals for some stratospheric warming, that could really spice things up, and that could allow that blocking to take over. So again, there's all these factors that are going in, and that's the reason why it's impossible to say what we're going to see. We're just looking for trends. We're just looking for a story that we could say, and then again, there could be alterations as we get nearer the time. And hopefully, by the end of these updates, in sort of mid to late November, we should have a rough idea of what we're expecting. And again, we'll have to compare and move things around when we do see alterations in that forecast. But regardless, very interesting from the output today. It does follow on fairly well from the first update, fairly similar outcomes, but not exactly the same, not exactly as westerly and as strong as we were seeing. So again, that's positive if you're looking for colder conditions, but it does look like it could be a real battle. So it's going to keep us on our toes as we head into the winter months. So anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you again for another video soon.